What's up, peeps? It's Miss Holt here with you again today for another virtual art lesson. Today we're going to do a little bit of arts integration with our 4th grade science standards. We're going to learn a little bit about the constellations of the night sky and space, and we're also going to learn a little bit about the wet on wet watercolor technique. We are going to paint our very own galaxy night sky and then add a constellation on top of that we've studied in science class. You're going to need some paper, water, watercolors, a paintbrush, and some tape to start. You're also going to need some white paint after our watercolor background has dried. So go ahead and gather your materials, put on your creativity cap, and let's get creating.
How about we take a break from Earth this time and talk about space? Now you might be thinking, but we've already learned about stars. Well, you're right, or at least you've been paying attention. But we learned about individual stars, basically how they do what they do as solo acts out there in the universe. But what happens when a bunch of stars band together to form a supergroup, sort of like the Avengers of the night sky? Well, then they're called a constellation. Today we'll talk about these groups of stars and why they're so important to astronomers, besides being just plain cool, or hot. You know what I mean. So, what exactly is a constellation? A constellation is a cluster of stars in the sky that have been grouped together in a pattern or shape and have been given a name. But before we take a closer look at constellations, let's review what a star is. Remember, a star is a bright object in space that gives off light through energy that it makes in its core. The sun is the most famous star to us Earthlings. We've already talked about a few other well-known stars though, like bright Betelgeuse. Astronomers use bright stars like Betelgeuse as markers in the sky to help find other, less bright objects in space. For example, if you were looking for a dim star like Sirius B, you might have to look for a long time to spot it among the many other stars in the sky. But if you're able to spot a much brighter star like Sirius A, and you know that Sirius B is located to the lower left of Sirius A, then it'll be much easier to find Sirius B. Like I said, there are so many stars in the sky that trying to spot just one can be tough, especially if it's not near a bright one like Betelgeuse or Sirius A. That's where constellations come in. Astronomers use constellations to help them better map the night sky. Think of stars like cities on a map and constellations like countries. Finding a large shape in the sky made of many stars is a lot easier to spot than trying to find one single speck. Plus, there are only 88 named constellations, which is a much more reasonable number to deal with than a billion. And most of the 88 recognized constellations came from the ancient Greeks. The stars in a constellation aren't related in any particular way. They just form a shape that the Greeks used to tell stories about their gods, goddesses, and mythical creatures like flying horses and giant scorpions. Now that we know what a constellation is, why don't we get to know some of the more famous ones? Harry Potter fans will recognize the name of our first constellation. Its name means dragon in Latin and also happens to be the name of Harry's biggest nemesis. Well, second biggest after he who must not be named, of course. Yep. It's Draco. According to legend, Draco was a dragon killed by the goddess Minerva and was tossed into the sky. Draco is one of 48 constellations described way back in the 2nd century by Egyptian astronomer Ptolemy. People have been seeing this dragon-like shape in the night sky for a long time. Constellations aren't just named after creatures, though. Some are named after mythical people, particularly gods and goddesses. One of the more well-known Greek gods has his own constellation, and a Disney movie. I'll give you a hint. He'll go the distance. It's Hercules. The stars in the Hercules constellation take the shape of the mighty hero as if he's holding a bow after just releasing an arrow. You go, Hercules. The name of our next notable constellation also makes an appearance in the Hercules movie as a super cute winged horse. Say hello to Pegasus. According to Greek mythology, Hercules never actually rode Pegasus like in the movie, but the flying horse did spend some time with Zeus, king of the gods. Zeus liked Pegasus so much he transformed him into a constellation and placed him in the night sky for everyone to see. Now, you're familiar with at least 3 of the 88 constellations in our sky, only 85 more to go. As the Earth rotates, you'll see Draco, Hercules, and Pegasus, plus all the other constellations over the course of a year. But more on when and where you can see the constellations in the next episode. So now you know what a star is, and that a cluster of stars in the sky that are grouped together in a particular pattern is called a constellation. Besides having really cool shapes and stories behind their names, constellations help astronomers and us map the night sky. Since space is so huge and massive and ginormous, our map is far from complete. So anything that helps us navigate that vast, well, space of space is okay by me. Thanks for the help, constellations.
Now that we've reviewed what constellations are, let's go ahead and gather up some materials to create our very own galaxy watercolor background. Once that background is dry and complete, we're going to use white paint to add our favorite constellations. All right, friends, so here are the things that you are going to need to create your watercolor constellation painting. You're going to start off with a piece of 4 by 8 watercolor paper. You're going to need some tape. Your watercolor palette comes with a brush, some water, and you're going to need your white jelly roll pen. We won't use our white pen until after our piece is dry because this is how we're going to create our constellations. But just for reference, these are the only things you're going to need to create your painting. So the first thing you need to do is tape the edges of your paper, and that's going to create a really nice crisp white border around our painting. So you just peel your tape off, you can tear it with your finger, and you want to line it up right along the edge. Try to get it as straight as you can. I like to tape mine to the table just because it keeps my paper from moving. And you're just going to do the same thing along all of the 4 sides of your paper. Tear yourself a little piece. Make sure if your tape has any rough edges like that, that goes on the outside. You really want the tape nice and straight facing your artwork. Once your artwork is taped off, it is time to paint. So you're going to need your water, your paintbrush, and your watercolor paint. This watercolor paint has the full spectrum, black, red, orange, yellow, green, blue. This is purple and brown. We are going to be using a lot of black and blue for this art project to begin with. So we're actually going to start with black and go in with the black because galaxies, you know, they're in space. So you need to start by wetting your paintbrush, dip it in the water, swirl around, glide off the edge. No tap dancing, and don't be crazy with your water. Swirl slowly, glide off the edge. You want to wake up your black paint just by swirling right on top. And you're going to instantly get that hair dye in your paintbrush. You don't want to gouge down into the paint. You want to lightly swirl right on top, and you can get a good amount of paint. You're going to go into the corners with a tapping motion. I'm not brushing, I'm tapping the black paint just into those corners right along those edges in almost a triangle way. If you need to go back in and get more paint, you can do that. More water as well. Right into those corners. We want these corners to be super dark. So we're going to tap in a good amount of that black paint. Now we want to create a wash on the rest of our painting. So we're going to rinse our brush clean of the black, and you're going to fill your brush up with just plain water, and you're going to go right around your entire work. Leave some gaps open without water. This process is called a wet on wet. So you're going to start with a wet piece of paper, a wet canvas, and then add in more wet. If you touch the edges of the black you've already laid down, that's going to pull that black color out into the water and create a really cool effect. You don't want to do that on all of that space, but it's a good way to blend things and make it look more natural. So notice that the only time I have used any actual brush strokes was when I was laying down that wash for the watercolor wash wet on wet project or piece of the project. I've mostly been using these tapping motions because that's going to create a more natural looking galaxy style. So now I'm going to go in with my blue, and I'm going to put my blue right over the black as a way to fade that black and blue together. Remember, you want to keep making sure you're adding water and paint as you need it. You can pull some of that blue out into the galaxy world. And by not putting water on every single part of my paper, I've created these kind of gaps of white. That's going to be helpful later if I want to add a lighter color like a yellow or even a red that I don't really want to blend in with these darker colors. Again, make sure you're using that tapping motion with your brush. You're not going straight in with brush strokes, but you're just lightly and quickly tapping color into your paper. You want to start creating these kind of pockets. So you're just going to naturally follow where the water is following. Tap, tap, tapping. And you're creating these like spindly looking arms out in your galaxy. Now you can kind of start to think about what other tones or colors you want to add to your galaxy once you have your basic black and blue down. I'm feeling more of like a purpley kind of blue vibe, so I'm going to go in with my purple. And in those areas of white, I'm going to start tapping in some purple. I'm building up these layers, and I'm thinking I want more of like a magenta or a pink. I don't have a magenta in my palette, but I can make it with the colors that I have or close to it. In the top side up here, I'm going to use this as a little mixing palette. So now that I have my color mixed, I'm going to go in with that in some areas. Remember, I'm not using those brush strokes. I am tap, tap, tapping the color. Because of the way my paper is laying, it's going to pool in some places and be raised in others. It's going to warp my paper. I'm going to use that to my advantage. I'm going to let that work for me instead of trying to work against it. I'm going to let the areas that it's pulling here, where it's creating these little puddles, I'm going to really load up the color in those areas. Whereas in the place where it's arching, I'm gonna let that area be a lighter spot. If I make a mistake and I go too far or add too much color or I make too much of a mess, I can always go in with a napkin and just blot in an area, and that's going to soak up some of that color. It's not going to turn the paper back white. It's not going to do that for me, but I can go back and soak up some of that darker color and revisit that if I want. I could even add like a red to that. If I wanted, maybe a little purple in there as well. Again, I'm not making brush strokes. I'm letting my hand tap, tap, tap. It looks like my hand is shaking, but that's literally what I'm doing. I'm tap, tap, tapping really quickly and kind of pushing the brushes into the paper versus making those more broad brush strokes. Okay, now we let it dry. If you want to peel this up off your table, you're just going to peel the parts of the tape that are on the table. You're not going to peel up the whole tape off your paper. You want to leave the tape on your paper, but just peel the pieces up and then just fold those over. Once it's dry, we're going to peel the tape off and then add our constellations. All right, once your paper is mostly dry, I still have a few wet spots, but the edges are mostly dry, it's time to take the tape off. So you're just going to peel it off from the back. And you're going to start peeling with the last tape you did on top. The best way to peel without pulling the paper off is to put your finger right at the little crease and start pulling back while pressing on the tape. So I'm pressing down on the tape and the paper and pulling my finger back. I had a little bit of a bleed right there, but that's okay. Then you're going to find the next piece that you did, which is here. And same thing, I'm going to pull back. And I'll zoom in for this one so you can see. Roll it back. And voila. So because I had the tape down, I have a really nice crisp like border around my galaxy painting. So the next step is to get my white gel marker, or my white gel pen. This is called a Jelly Roll, pen. And it writes with a white gel. It's like a ballpoint pen, so there's a little ball in the tip that rolls. So you can get a really nice line. You can get really small dots, a little bit bigger, depending on how large you want your stars. And you can even get really teeny tiny dots. So the jelly roll works out really nicely. I still have a really wet spot right here, so I'm going to just avoid that area. I'm going to start thinking about my constellation. So when looking at constellations, I really liked the Ursa Major constellation grouping. So I looked up a picture of that online, and I'm going to use that as reference to transfer that constellation to my background. So I started out on my constellation using the white gel pen. Unfortunately, it didn't want to work with the watercolor. Maybe if the watercolor was a little bit more dry, it would have been a more successful thing. But instead, I just got some white tempera paint with some a very small detail brush and use that instead. I looked at a picture of the Ursa Major constellation and I just placed the points as best as I could to match that constellation on my picture. I wanted the stars of my constellation to be nice and big, so I made those a little bit thicker, and I just took my time and carefully connected those constellation stars to each other. Then I used the same brush and the same paint to go around the constellation and put in some smaller, more detailed stars. I just pressed very lightly to create those really far away looking stars. I did use the gel pen to create some of those smaller stars as well. Then I just wrote the name at the bottom of my paper in cursive, and that is how I created my constellation watercolor artwork. All right, folks, hope you enjoyed creating that astronomy project with me. Remember, we use the science standard obtain and communicate information to describe how constellations, including Ursa Major, Ursa Minor, and Orion, appear to move from Earth's perspective throughout the seasons. We also use the visual art standard. I can use the elements and principles of art to create artwork. I can use some materials, techniques, and tools to create artwork. We also use the art standard. I can show art concepts among arts disciplines, other content areas, and related careers. I hope you guys enjoyed doing some arts integration with me, and we'll see you next time.